This may be the worst story you've ever heard. I am warning you, this video will leave you thinking, what the fuck? We go to May the 10th, 2003. This was the day Smith Storage of Safford, Arizona was auctioning off the contents of delinquent renters' units. Thomas Bright hadn't had any plans to attend the auction until his good friend Tom Summers invited him to come along. He certainly never had any intentions of bidding on anything, but he did and got more than what he'd bargained for. The boxes Bright won were covered in a thick layer of dust. It was obvious no one had touched this stuff for quite some time. A cursory glance in the boxes showed only some old pictures, a lot of paper documents, and some ratty old clothing. Bright left the boxes in his stepson's carport, thinking he'd go through them later. The following Monday evening, Bright figured it was time to rummage around the musty boxes and see if there was anything worth salvaging. If not, a friend of his had said he'd be willing to take it off his hands. Bright found an old computer keyboard and a very obsolete Nintendo gaming system in a couple of boxes. Not major finds, but enough to make him curious enough to keep digging. He then pulled another box from the pile and opened it. A horribly rank odor immediately penetrated his sense of smell, but Bright figured it was probably from some small critter that had found its way into the box and died. So he kept digging through the moldy blankets until he came across a smaller box. He was familiar with the old age of how good things come in small packages, and he eagerly opened the small box. The raunchy smell grew stronger. As he would later describe, the smell was more of an earthy, musty smell. Three plastic wrapped objects were in this small box. Carefully unwrapping one of the items, the odor became overwhelming. Bright set the item aside and began unwrapping a second, and again he was hit with the harsh, musty smell. It was then Bright asked himself, what the hell is all this? He began pulling the plastic from the third bag. A sense of foreboding, screaming something was horribly wrong, but the eyes and mind demanding to see for themselves. Inside package number 3 was the remains of an infant. Bright would discover he'd almost uncovered the same thing in the first two packages as well. 3 dead infants, years beyond their day of death, left to rot away in a storage shed. No one would have ever known they were there if it were not for a spur of the moment decision to go with a friend to a Saturday morning auction. So the question remained, who are these infants? This is where we come on to Diane Odell. One of Diane Odell's earliest memories was the time she was assaulted at only 6 years old. Earlier in the evening, her father had instructed her to answer the door if anyone came calling. When a knock sounded at the door later in the evening, Diane did as she had been told. When she had barely gotten the door open, she was confronted by a masked man holding a knife. He told her that if she screamed, he would take her life. Diane tried to run as she screamed for her father. She knew he could hear her. She could even see him sitting at the dining room table, but just sat there, ignoring her pleas. As she was being assaulted by the masked man, Diane saw her father poke his head around the corner and watch the whole thing. Dirty bastard. Diane would also later claim after it was over, her father walked up to her abuser and said, "Good job, son." If little Diane had been confused by this statement, it all became clear when her abuser pulled off his stocking mask and she saw the face of her older half brother. What the fuck? Right then and there, Diane knew the only way to survive was to be invisible. No matter how hard She tried to be unseen, it was never enough. Over the next several years, Diane would be the victim of horrendous physical and emotional abuse. Between the ages of 6 and 16, Diane claims her father, John Molina, repeatedly, physically, and sexually assaulted her. At one point, she and her mother, Mabel, moved out of the house and in with one of her half brothers and his wife. Mabel claimed both of them were too much for the already strained household and sent her daughter back to John's house. Diane would later say her 16th birthday marked the beginning of her mother prostituting her out to pay off drug and gambling debts as a means of extra income. She also claimed her father continued to abuse her during this time as well. In 1972, Diane and her mother moved to Sullivan County in New York, a small place nestled in the Catskill Mountains. Before she left, her father John abused her again. Then Diane learned she was pregnant. Yeah, her father made her pregnant. Mabel was outraged when she learned her daughter was pregnant, especially by her own father, and it turned into a physical argument that left Diane standing on her father's doorstep asking for a place to live until the baby was born. Diane's father himself was outraged by his daughter's pregnancy, seemingly taking no responsibility in the matter, but also because she had reappeared on his doorstep. According to Diane, her father abused her out of anger, but allowed her to stay. She remained there until another assault several months later, sending her scrambling back to her mother. And soon, when she went back to her mother, Diane went into labor. Diane later said her mother refused to call an ambulance or drive her to the hospital, so she delivered the baby boy, whom she named Matthew. The infant was stillborn. Diane packed his tiny body into an old blue suitcase. Regarding the stillborn Matthew, there's a huge twist, but I'll come on to that later. Keep listening. In January 1974, at 20 years old, Diane married a Jewish man. Being half Latino and half Caucasian, Diane wasn't well accepted by his family. When her husband got sick shortly after this small wedding, it put an even greater strain on the couple after he received a kidney transplant in 1975. Slowly, the couple divorced. Now, in August 1977, Diane married James Odell, which is where she got her name from. Her name was Diane Molina, but it became Odell when she married James. They got married just before he shipped out to boot camp after enlisting in the Navy. After his training was over, James returned home and Diane immediately got pregnant. In 1978, Diane gave birth to a daughter. The home Diane and James shared wasn't well insulated, and when the winter came, Diane insisted they find better housing facilities. James agreed and found them a house to rent not far from where they were living at the time. The little blue suitcase containing Matthew's body was left behind. James had changed since he returned from the Navy. Diane claimed she walked on eggshells when she was around him. The tension was so great, Diane feared announcing a third pregnancy, her second child, with James. They'd just moved. James was unhappy, and their daughter was still an infant. It just wasn't a good time to say she was expecting. And in the summer of 1979, a couple of significant events happened. The first involved the separation of Diane and James. They simply had enough of one another. The second one involved her former landlord, who had decided to clean out his rented bungalow before putting it on the market. During his cleaning, the landlord discovered the blue suitcase and was stunned by the discovery of a baby's body inside. But instead of calling the police, however, the landlord called Mabel and told her she had better come reclaim it. She did, and little Matthew remained a secret. On November the 12th, 1979, James and Diane welcomed a second daughter into the world, which contributed to the resolution to give their marriage a second try. But James only had one ultimatum. He said Mabel had to go. So, leaving her mother behind, Diane headed out with James and their girls for a new beginning in Florida. But life would not be all sunshine and rainbows as she had hoped. James began staying out late. Some nights he didn't bother coming home at all. He was drinking heavily, and Diane suspected he was cheating as well. Diane was ready to throw in the towel again, but James begged her to give him another chance. This time it was Diane with the ultimatum: they had to return to New York. James agreed. However, once they got to New York, sometime after, the couple again separated. But Diane discovered she was pregnant a fourth time. Diane had thought even with the separation, James would still be part of the children's lives. James had left her and the kids both physically and financially. Now, on February the 19th, 1981, John Molina died at age 80 after a long, painful battle with stomach cancer. Diane, who attended the funeral with her mother, delivered a third daughter 3 days later. Just a few months after the birth, Diane began casually dating another man. To no one's surprise, she found herself once again pregnant. Unlike the 3 previous births, Diane would receive no prenatal care, just as had been the case with baby Matthew. The day she went into labor with her fifth child, Diane would later say her mother told her she had called for an ambulance, but the instinct to push took over. Mabel said Diane delivered the infant after she passed out, following an extremely loud ringing sound in her ear. When she woke up, according to Diane, the infant was dead. Mabel told her daughter the infant had suffered breathing difficulties. Diane claimed she insisted they rush the infant to the hospital, but Mabel declared the doctors would think the death was intentional. When Diane continued to insist, Mabel reminded her about the first baby and then hinted she would get custody of the girls. So Diane relented and packed this baby away, just as she had Matthew. This woman has had more pregnancies than I've had hot dinners. How do you feel about her so far? How mind-bending is this story? Don't worry, it gets worse. James' brother showed up in the latter months of 1982. Remember James, the ex-husband? Claiming he had come to visit his nieces. During his visit, he and Diane would become intimate, and of course, she became pregnant. Wow. Just like the previous birth, Diane sought no prenatal care. Just with Diane's fifth birth, she would claim her mother delivered the infant while she was unconscious. This was in mid-1983. The baby again was dead when Diane revived, and she bundled this infant up and packed it away with its siblings. As was becoming a regular habit, Diane was pregnant in 1984 by a man she lived with briefly. Again, there was no prenatal care and only another dead baby after she gave birth while being unconscious. This fourth deceased infant was wrapped up just as the others and stored away, only to be a fleeting thought each time their mother moved. Years later, when their tiny bodies were discovered, Diane would claim she had kept the babies as a means to keep her mother in line, knowing should Mabel try to take her daughters or do anything else to her, the babies' bodies would serve as evidence. What kind of mother-daughter relationship is that? Now, in early 1989, junk and scrap dealer Max Shapiro was contacted about removing an abandoned vehicle which had been left behind by the previous tenants of the residence from which the lady was calling. 2 days after the call, Max gained possession of the car, but it would sit in his junkyard for a couple of months before he got around to going through it, looking for anything of value before he sent it through the press and sold it for scrap. The treasure hunt, however, would result in a find beyond Max's wildest dreams. When he popped the trunk on the abandoned Volkswagen, Max spotted a little blue suitcase. Using the same crowbar he used in the truck, he popped open the suitcase. He immediately recognized the contents as being that of a dead infant. Touching nothing more, Max phoned the state police, who arrived a short time later. Detectives were shocked to find the owner of the car and presumably of the suitcase too so easily. The owner had made no effort to conceal her identity. A photo in the car bore Diane's name, and the car was still registered in her name as well. After police tracked her down, Diane was on doctor ordered bed rest with her 10th pregnancy. Nonetheless, officers told Diane she would need to come to the precinct for questioning, and she complied. Upon her arrival, detectives questioned Diane about the suitcase and the baby inside, but she denied any knowledge whatsoever of the now mummified fetus. Investigators, however, weren't believing her story. Sending the infant's body off to the state, the results would later reveal that baby Matthew was actually a female infant who died 20 years before. Confronted with this information, Diane decided to come clean. She told investigators she had delivered the child 17 years before, but the baby had been stillborn after she had been abused by her father. Prosecutors considered prosecuting her father, but they learned he was deceased. They didn't believe, however, Diane had murdered or self-aborted her child and therefore did not charge her with any crime. Of course, they had no way of knowing 3 other tiny bodies were stored away at Diane's residence, just waiting to be found. After Diane gave birth to her 10th child in August 1989, and when I say 10th child, I mean this is the 6th that was living, work began to dwindle for Robert Sauerstein, her boyfriend at the time. They decided to head west where Robert knew he could find employment. In 91, Diane gave birth to an 11th child in Utah. Life seemed good for the large family until Diane's oldest daughter, the alleged victim of statutory assault by an older man she had been dating. So the family picked up stakes and stayed south to Arizona. With 7 children, Mabel, Diane, and Robert, it was hard to find any place large enough to accommodate them. Trying to create space, the couple rented 2 self-storage sheds to hold some of their belongings, including a box with 3 of Diane's deceased babies. Although no one knew about them except for Diane and Mabel, no sooner had they settled into Arizona than Diane announced she was pregnant again. But a couple of months later, she would miscarry. Among the mundanity of working and raising children, James, remember the ex-husband, would occasionally rear his ugly head to cause drama by having the children accuse their stepfather of abuse. With legal troubles now adding to the list of household bills, Diane and her family struggled to keep the electricity on and the rent paid. But the self-storage rental was paid out on time without fail. Do you know why? Why did she make sure the self-storage was paid? Well, that's where the infant bodies were hidden. She couldn't risk not paying it. Robert finally got fed up with the accusations by James and Diane's kids and decided it was time to go to Texas because he refused to go to jail for something he didn't do. Diane and Robert took off with few possessions, even leaving behind their stuff in their self-storage units. Nonetheless, Diane made sure each rental payment to the self-storage was paid each month. Life in Texas was no better. Jobs were scarce and bills minus the storage rental weren't getting paid. If things weren't hard enough, Mabel was sick and insisting on going home to New York. Once again, Diane and her family packed up their meager belongings and turned their car east. But they would only make it to Virginia before their car broke down, and the family had to take up quarters in a church-managed homeless shelter. While there, Diane's oldest daughter, who was 15 at the time, caused problems for the family when she started a relationship with a 21-year-old man. The shelter personnel told Diane she needed to get the situation under control or they would ask her family to leave. Diane sat her daughter down to tell her she was no longer going to be allowed to date the young man, but instead of just being a talk, it turned into a screaming match. It ended with Child Protective Services coming in, removing the daughter from Diane's care, and Diane being charged with assault. Diane tried to make amends with her daughter, but the teenage girl would have no part of it. Diane gave up and headed home to New York. The issues with her daughter and her own criminal charges were unsolved. Then, in 1995, Mabel died. In June 1998, Diane's second daughter gave birth to a healthy baby boy, followed by another boy for Diane a little more than a year later. And going back to the beginning of the story, after Thomas Bright's discovery of the bodies in the material from the storage unit auction, Arizona law enforcement tracked down Diane in Pennsylvania. Diane tried to maintain that the infants had been stillborn, but her story kept changing and eventually became too suspicious, and she was arrested by New York State Police in 2003. Diane's defense at trial continued to be the stillborn argument, along with citing her physical and sexual abuse as a factor. Perhaps out of sympathy, a jury didn't convict her of first degree murder, but she was convicted of second degree murder for all three infants. Right now, Diane Odell is currently incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York. She was sentenced to 25 years in 2004. Her earliest parole date is in May of 2028, where she would be 75 years old. The judge in the case was Frank Labuda. He said he was not unmoved by the letters he received from Diane's children. They asked him for mercy. He said the sentencing was not for punishment and retribution, but for reaffirmation of the respect for life we Americans have, a country dedicated to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The judge said, "You have violated a basic tenet, a basic principle, a basic belief that all Americans have, a right to life and liberty. It was a dark tale that you created, no matter how small, a life." And you might be wondering, well, how did the police find out about the other three babies? Well, once they captured her in Pennsylvania, she told them that they're in a storage shed. For her to continuously get pregnant, either she didn't believe in contraception or she just didn't know it existed. I'm guessing the abuse as a child maybe made her sexual activity normal. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. But generally, when I was reading it and finding out about the story, what kind of life is this? They were poor. She kept getting pregnant. And something tells me her pregnancies weren't financial endeavors, benefits from the government or whatever. The abuse from the father was her father was the father of one of her children, like father. Like, it makes no sense. I told you in the beginning, this is a fucked up story. I actually have nothing else to say. Why don't you tell me what you think?